Hello, everybody. So I'm Alan. I'm the lead cartographer at Stamen. For those of you who don't know too much about us, we're actually smaller than you may think. There's only about 10 of us who work at Stamen. We're a design studio based in San Francisco. We actually do many things other than maps, too. We do a lot of data visualization. We do strategic communications. Maps is just one part of what we work on. We use open source tools whenever we can. We use open data whenever we can. And pretty much everything we do is client services. So people come to us with some problem that they have data that they need mapped. Sometimes, in rare cases, we can get grants to do work for the public benefit. So a lot of our Openstreetmap work has been around that. And in very rare cases, we have enough time to do things for fun on our own. But seriously, that almost never happens. So usually we're working with data that people bring to us. And I want to talk about one aspect of kind of how I think about how we work, this idea of being a professional amateur. And I'll explain that in a moment. But in short, what I'm thinking about is we know almost nothing about the data that people bring to us. We're not experts in really any field. Often, if we were doing a map of river systems, for example, we would have to spend days and days working with domain experts to figure out what is the best way to visualize it. So we're almost always a complete novice once we start on a project. And in some ways, I feel like that gives us an advantage. In some ways, that is perhaps the benefit that we're bringing to a situation. And sometimes being able to think of a problem as though you are a complete beginner, a complete novice, complete amateur, that gives you another way to get around that problem. It can kind of give you a different prompt to think about how you might make a map, how you might solve a challenge. So in this presentation, I'm going to just talk really quickly about a lot of kind of anecdotes of where I am sort of seeing that pattern happen at Stamen. I don't really have a theory for what being a professional amateur is maybe yet. Maybe we can work on that together. You can help me with that. This talk is part of me trying to figure that out. So unlike some of the earlier talks that we just saw in this session, it's not very going to go into much detail about anything specific. But I think it does follow on a lot to some of the talks I saw earlier this morning, especially like Dylan's talk about how to go crazy, go carto crazy, or Soren talking about how to deal with constraints, meaning clients. But I've actually been thinking about what it means to be an amateur in mapping for a long time. So in graduate school, I was studying Openstreetmap, and I spent a lot of time studying how it evolved, what the culture of Openstreetmap is. And by the way, before I really get too much into that, these are some maps that I made kind of as a side effect of my research, where I was looking at the history of Openstreetmap and downloading the entire Openstreetmap history file into my computer, and one day I just accidentally drew everything all at once, which I didn't really intend to do. I mean, this is a file that includes every historical version of every feature that's been in Openstreetmap. And to just quickly catch you up about Openstreetmap is like Wikipedia for maps. Just like every Wikipedia page, you can actually look to see who edited it last, what they changed, what it looked like in the very first version. We can do that with Openstreetmap too. And if you end up just drawing that, drawing every feature incredibly lightly, you get this huge amount of detail that kind of emerges out of the map that I wasn't really expecting, and nor was I expecting it to be this beautiful and interesting. So what we see, this is London, where Openstreetmap got started, and you see a clear hierarchy of important roads, minor roads. You see density of population, of interest, of activity, and all that is just not emerging from roads that are tagged as this is a primary road and this is a minor road. It's because the more important roads or the primary roads have been edited more often. So there's kind of an insight that kind of came out of this without even trying, kind of getting lucky. And that's a bit of a theme that I'll kind of come back to throughout today. But basically, within the cartographic and the geographic literature, thinking about things like Openstreetmap or this term volunteer geographic information, often boils down into talking about these are amateur mappers. These are people who are not trained in cartography like most of us in this room are, although not all of us, hopefully, and certainly that's part of what makes this interesting. But this idea of this amateur is really complicated and could mean so many different things. Like, do we mean that they're not experts? Do we mean that they're not professionals doing this for their day job? Do we just mean that they're not authoritative, that they don't have the stamp of approval from some government entity? It means a whole lot of different things. So it could be someone who is working on something because they find it interesting and that they're not as a profession. Or it could be someone who's just lacking in experience. They could be doing this as their job, but they're just not very good at it. That's what some people might mean by amateur. Or if we kind of go back more to the root of the word, and we're in Montreal, like to be an amateur, to be someone who loves something or is devoted to it just because you're passionate about it. That's kind of underlying a lot of this, but is a term that gets lost a little bit. And so in other senses of that, it's like a connoisseur, a nerd or a geek, or an otaku from kind of the Japanese culture of just being really obsessed with something and knowing everything about it for no good reason. No one's paying you to do that. So one of the things I was arguing in my grad school research was that I think OpenStreetMappers are kind of expert amateurs, oxymoronic as that sounds. They are often incredibly knowledgeable about the things that they're mapping. They're just not being paid to do it. There's incredibly detailed, railroads and airports and so on, all in OpenStreetMap. So they're often experts, but not necessarily professionals. So they're doing it for money, not for money, but for love. And also OpenStreetMap is just great because it's an amazing data source that you can use to make things like Stamen's watercolor map. So this happened, watercolor was made before I started at Stamen. But when I joined, it was very much, I hear a lot of stories about how watercolor got made. And it's all like taken on mythic proportions for me in terms of thinking about how Stamen as an entity thinks and works and makes maps. It was created by Nathaniel Kelso, Geraldine Sarmiento, who was, both of whom are here today, the late Zach Watson, who was tragically lost a few years ago. We have a Zach Watson scholarship fund if anyone wants to help out with funding data visualization practitioners. And so one thing you need to know about Stamen, though, is that almost nobody is a trained cartographer. I am a little bit, and before me, Nathaniel was at Stamen, but other than that, they're journalists, they're developers, they're visual designers, a lot of architecture school dropouts. There's something about that leads you into mapping. So it was fascinating for me to start to understand how these amateur cartographers who obviously love maps but have never been trained about maps are doing what they do. And to see the process of I should have mentioned that all of these are very short links where you can see these, some of the slides and some of the sources for this stuff, and I'll share that again at the end of the presentation. I mean, one thing that amateurs are, they're fascinated by extremes. Like if you understand a system and you want to basically see what happens if you turn all the knobs to 11, you want to know how it works in that sense, but if you're a professional, you never want to turn everything all to 11. You want to find just the sweet spot. So in a lot of these watercolor permutations that were being made to see what happens if we tweak all the settings, what actual amount of blobbiness is what we're going for. And to kind of see like what happens if you just go through all of those different permutations. And so one of the things that, again, this is kind of perhaps an even apocryphal story that I just hear passed down to me now, is that our one lone cartographer at the time was complaining that you can't blur them that much. All the roads are blending together. Like you can't actually understand what's going on here. And if Nathaniel's in the room, he can correct me if that's what he was not saying. But our creative director was like, that's exactly the point, is that we want to see what happens if we go beyond what an actual productive, effective map might look like. And it becomes a map that is useful for something else. It becomes a map that is not meant to be for navigation. It's meant for dwelling in, experiencing as a map, for dawdling rather than trying to navigate. And so amateurs have a leeway to create things that may be less utilitarian and functional, but they can evoke pleasure or beauty because they're passionate about the medium, about the thing. And in this case, Stamen was lucky because we were funded by the Knight Foundation to create a bunch of maps based on OpenStreetMap data for anyone to use, and this was one of the things that Stamen was paid to do. So in that sense, I think Stamen may be in a lucky position, but it also might be something that's true for a lot of people in this room, that you're kind of paid to be an amateur, paid to do something with passion or with creativity, not necessarily to an immediate end, but knowing that something interesting will come out of it. Some way approaching a problem with that beginner's mind that is like really kind of prized in Zen Buddhism in particular. Like, once you learn about how to do something, you can no longer kind of see it with that fresh first approach. Also, when I started Stamen, I didn't really know what even design was, or what it means, or what the definition of design is. And as I tried to understand how designers define what they do, it seems to be as a problem solver. And again, isn't everybody kind of solving problems in their work? Like, what makes that special? Something about not knowing about any specific thing, any domain expertise, just knowing about process and being really familiar with the process of solving problems. Maybe that's also what geographers and cartographers are. So that's one thing that I think I see a lot in how Stamen has made maps, how we often are still making maps today, is trying to find what we would do if we didn't know what we were doing and somehow be good at doing that. So some more practical examples. Here's a sea level rise map that we made with Climate Central. We made this actually several years ago, but we've continued to work with them to improve it over time. And one of the things that as cartographers often do when they're making sea level rise maps is it's too tempting to try to make it look realistic in the future. So almost always you see the sea levels rise, they flood the land that's going to be flooded, and then you're really trying to create an accurate future coastline. But one of the things that, especially a person who is more of a lay map reader, what do you do when you first look at a map? You always want to find your house. And all of those maps, you no longer see your house on them, on these sea level rise maps. So one of the things I really like about how this map works is we reverse that paradigm, and all of the flooded areas actually are revealing the satellite imagery with a blue tint on them. And trying to get my GIF animations to start here. One of the things that also, in all of our work, we are working with domain experts usually on the client side. So we're working with climate scientists. We're working with the data scientists who might be producing the data for us. And a lot of the negotiations that go on in the process of making a map are how much can we simplify, how much can we leave off, how much must we leave off to prevent misinterpretation, and how do you lead users and map readers into the more detailed, more scientific reports when they need it and where they need it in the visualization. And one thing that you'll notice about all of these maps for the sea level rise is that they don't include dates on them at all, even though there are a lot of very specific climate projections behind these maps saying, here's what we think it will be under such and such scenario in the year 2080 or something, in order to prevent sort of climate denier arguments over the fact that you're causing all this alarm by showing how high the seas are going to be, but that's not going to happen within any of our lifetimes, for example. We're kind of leaving that up to the context of however someone else might be using these maps. We're kind of leaving those kind of questions off the table, just knowing that nitpicking might be something that the amateur might try to do as they read this map or try to use it in another way. It's difficult to try to not get into too much detail about any of these, but let's talk about them afterward if you have further questions about any of these maps. Another climate maps we did was with the Audubon Society. And again, we didn't have to do any data analysis. They had GIS experts and domain experts doing modeling of where bird species in North America are likely to be found into the future based on expected changes in the climate. And this was one where they dropped 600 different rasters on us of 600 different bird species. And as we opened them up, the plan was to create some kind of ISO lines out of these to create surfaces. But immediately just looking at the maps and looking at those rasters, it's like, those are beautiful already. How do we not mess up those? How do we just show the raw data as much as possible? What is it about that raw data, this wispy uncertainty, that actually does serve the purpose of the map in a way that how we thought we kind of had to moderate the experience would not have done? So we use the harder lines to show a surface of where the ranges are now, and we let that probability surface project into the future, and to be able to communicate a sense of uncertainty, that this is a actual scientific analysis and projection. We can't say one way or another whether there will necessarily be a bird habitat in this area, but we think that there's likely to be so. And also, I think this is another case where, for me, having worked with GIS and having seen rasters like this, when I opened it up, I'm like, all right, let's get to work finding these boundaries. And it was the hovering art director who was the one to be able to say, that's beautiful as it is, kind of stop, don't wreck it, see what we can do with what it is. Being able to bring that, again, those the eyes of more of an amateur, of just like, what is in this, the medium and the data itself that is going to be compelling. We also had to discuss with Audubon about their scientists had 3 different climate scenarios, and again, we're like, the public doesn't need that for this purpose. We need to just pick one. We're not going to bring in that kind of distraction. So we have 600 of these. And a few other quicker ones that I've actually talked about at NACIS back when these projects were in process about a couple years ago. We spent a full year working with these digital historians at the University of Richmond in Virginia, doing these maps of, basically this one is about the forced migration of enslaved people in the antebellum South, using what we can determine, or what they could determine from census data about enslaved populations in different counties, and being able to model the migration within the U.S. after the transatlantic slave trade had ended. So there's all kinds of really detailed data processing and data analysis that luckily we didn't have to be privy to. One of the things that was especially challenging working with the historical census data is that all these county boundaries change between each census. For a long time, we thought we have to find some way to rapidly display all those changing boundaries and make it clear to the user what's going on. We ended up falling back to hex bins, which we tried very hard to avoid. It turns out that they were actually the right thing to do to kind of smooth out these changes over time. So we took all of the county data of in-migrations and out-migrations, sliced them up with hexagons, and kind of smoothed things out. Another project that was part of that series was foreign-born populations within the U.S. We did a kind of a fun different layout here, moving the continents around, resizing them. All they were really context for proportional symbols. And I don't have the original whiteboard, but I'm pretty sure that layout came from us whiteboarding out where we needed to put things, and it became a layout that emerged from our instinctive, like trying to draw things on a napkin, basically. So one of these lessons I feel like are, trust your initial sketches, because they often are telling you what the layout needs to be. So often the very first thing you try tends to be a layout that will work when you come back to it. Not always, of course, but there's often a kernel of truth in there. And finally, I wanted to show at least one more, one that we've done for fun. Almost never we get to do that. We were helping with the Openstreetmap import of open data from the County of Los Angeles. They had all of their building footprints made available, and we were importing those into OpenStreetMap. And again, I just had it up on my screen, all of these buildings, and our creative director walks by and is like, that's beautiful, how do we do something with that? We're seeing something in there just coming out of the fact that the data is great. And often if you're lucky, the data is just great and it's telling you something, and it looks amazing as you just open it up. Just something about what can you tell from the texture of a city, of what's land use is happening just by the sizes and shapes of buildings. So we ended up trying to crank up that effect by using and this is just straight out of CartoDB, using a color ramp from black to white for building footprint size. And then underneath that is the parcels, which have a reversed black and white color ramp. So you end up just getting this texture that really is almost more, it's almost more interesting than the raw data, but it feels like you're just looking at raw data. It's kind of like trying to make the raw look more raw because of these changing gradients that intersect with each other, because often large buildings are on large lots, small buildings are on small lots, but sometimes they're not, and you get different blending of these kind of cool gray effects. And one of the things we also try to think about in terms of being an amateur, working with our tools like an amateur, is like just use one thing, try to take it to its limit. We put 3 million buildings into Carto. It gives us a different way of seeing the detail that you couldn't if we had to turn things into vector tiles, for example, where at this zoom you would have so many of the buildings filtered out. It takes a long time to render. So I have made it so that you actually are loading multiple layers. So you load the parcels as a separate layer and then the building. So as you pan around, you actually make the fact that it takes some time to render kind of a fun thing. You kind of work with the limitations of the tools and try to see what's interesting about them. And a little bit of a teaser, we have an intern from Carnegie Mellon, Aman Tawari, who is training an artificial intelligence to look at satellite imagery and figure out what the demographics are. This is online, you can play with it. We're gonna have more to talk about with this project coming up soon, but basically we were hired by Digital Globe to test out their online analysis platform and to see what you could do with it, to see how you could break it. And so we trained it to figure out what the demographics were from a particular building, and then we let you, as a user, break it by putting snippets of other maps, of other imagery elsewhere. And so go home and play with this, and we will hopefully have more kind of bizarre, weird things coming out of this machine learning work in the future. So I know I didn't leave too much time for questions, so I would be happy to talk with anybody afterward. Thank you.